Hey there, I'm Josh, and welcome to my new series, The Lord of the Rings, Artifacts of Arda. If you didn't already know it, I love The Lord of the Rings, and I plan for this to be an ongoing monthly series where I go through all three films and try to recreate iconic props and items from the films. I'm going to try to base each episode on a particular item in the order that it's seen in the film, or at least according to its importance to each moment in the film. For instance, maybe I should first make the One Ring as it's the first thing that we see. However, I chose to make Narsil, the broken sword of Elendil, because of its significance to that moment. It's the blade that cut the ring. And don't worry, the One Ring will be coming along shortly, I promise. I know it's not really a big deal, and I'm probably over-explaining it all, but my intention is to go in an order that you'll be able to follow along and see each item's place in the story. Plus, hopefully it'll build some anticipation for you guys to get excited about it and try to guess what's going to be in the next episode. My plan is to release each episode on the final Wednesday of each month. And since this year marks the 20th anniversary of the release of Fellowship of the Ring, I only saw it fitting to dedicate this entire year to that film. So all 12 episodes will be based on Fellowship, meaning that next year is going to be all about the Two Towers and the following year about the Return of the King. So if you're counting along, this marks the first of 36 episodes. This is something I'm really excited about and is by far the most ambitious collective project that I've ever attempted. So if this is something you guys are interested in and enjoy, please share it and tell your friends about it, because it will only help this series and this channel grow. Another thing, about the title, Artifacts of Arda. Arda is the Elvish word for Earth, which of course includes Middle-earth. So there you go. Plus, I'm a sucker for any titles that are rich in alliteration. And one last thing, I want to say a special thanks to my wife and my friends for really helping me to plan and workshop this whole idea. Anyway, let's get started on the first episode of The Lord of the Rings, Artifacts of Arda. I hope you enjoy it. Our project begins, like many do, with the cutting of wood. Basswood, to be exact. In fact, this project, and many after it, are going to be made of this particular type of wood. And that's because, in my opinion, it has the perfect characteristics for this type of application. So the first thing I'm doing is cutting it and shaping it into a workable piece of stock. I got this particular piece of stock down to 50 inches long, 2.5 inches wide, and 1/2 inch thick. This will be the perfect size to start working it into a full-size sword. The next thing I'm doing is cutting a groove into each side of the blade. To do that, I'm using a round-nosed router bit that I installed in my router table. In the brief amount of research that I did to figure out what this groove is called, I found that it's commonly referred to as either a fuller or a blood groove, and that it's a rather contentious subject, with each side offering a strongly worded opinion. I myself would offer an opinion on the subject, but I don't care. Moving on, I glued down a full-size template to use as a reference. The template is a picture that I found online of the officially licensed replica from United Cutlery. Arguably the better path of least resistance that one could use to acquire such a replica. You know, instead of messing around with all this bullcrap. And by all accounts, it looks like they make quite a fine product. However, that's not the point of this series. It's to figure out how to hand make all of these replicas, and me getting to have fun while I do it.
That goes for you all, too.
After I got most of the details marked out, I took the piece to the bandsaw to start cutting it more into its rough shape. I made a pass down either side of the blade and was sure to cut it just proud of the line. After I removed some material around the tang for the grip, I then used the orbital sander to shape the sides of the blade down to the lines. I also went ahead and did a once-over sanding on the flat sides of the blade. I then marked a line along the perfect center of the sides to use as a reference for the edge. I mapped out a few more details to use as a reference for the shaping process, which I'll be getting to very shortly. But first, I used my wood carving chisels to add a shallow taper to that blood groove or fuller, whatever the heck it's called. I smoothed things out a bit with some sandpaper and then took the blade over to the belt sander to start the shaping process. My first attempt at shaping the edge was by using the sanding belt, which was a little bit dicey. And I quickly found out that I didn't have enough control and decided to use something else. So I switched over to the sanding disc that is attached to the side and had much better results. The small work table provided a more steady work surface for me to rest the blade, and I was able to more consistently control the angle. Once I was done honing it down more closely to its final shape, I switched back to the orbital sander to fine-tune it the rest of the way. I did this through a series of light passes and was very cautious not to take it too far. Once that was satisfactory, I sanded it by hand to make it even smoother, using a combination of sandpaper and ultra-fine steel wool. At this point, the blade was pretty much done, so I switched over to making the hilt. For this, I used a thicker chunk of basswood that I had lying around, and I cut it down to size. I'll be starting with the crossguard first, so I marked a series of reference lines before beginning to outline the shape of the crossguard. I did this by consulting a number of reference photos, since the picture that I had enlarged and printed out for the template was very pixelated and very low resolution. Once I got the side profile mapped out, I flipped the block over and charted out the top-down profile. You can see I also marked the center slot where I'll be removing material for the blade to pass through. To do that, I took the block to the drill press where I drilled a series of holes using a Forstner bit, before switching to a regular twist bit to hog out the material in between. Once the slot was cut to its rough size, I put the block in a vise and used a large file to clean it up. After that was satisfactory, I slid the blade through for a test fit. Right now it has a nice tight fit, which is exactly what I was hoping for. Up next, I used the bandsaw to start cutting the block into shape. I did this by first very carefully cutting away large chunks of material from the sides. I then took those cut-off pieces and used some crazy glue to attach them back into place. Once those were secure, I flipped the block over and cut along the side profile outline. After I got the piece cut to its rough shape, I took it to the belt sander to smooth away any rough spots from what will be the top and the bottom and the curved edges. I left the blanks glued onto the side so that I could help improve the consistency and accuracy while sanding to avoid drift. I then used a wood chisel to knock those blanks away one at a time. Next, I took the piece back to the belt sander to clean up all the side surfaces. While I was at it, I also used the belt sander to start adding some beveling to the crossguard. At this point, I started using my wood carving chisels in an attempt to further shape the crossguard, but I really wasn't having good luck with it, so I ended up switching over to my rotary carver with the drum sander attachment. I had much better results with this, and it worked really well to get it into the shape that I was wanting. There's one thing that I want to note that you may or may not have noticed so far in this video, and that is the flickering effect that randomly pops into the footage. This is something that I didn't notice until post-production because it didn't show up in the monitor for the camera, but it's really annoying. It's also something that I'm going to be very conscientious about for future videos. If you don't know what I'm talking about, pay close attention to your screen and you'll notice some light and dark bars that are rippling across it. I just wanted to point it out because I noticed it and it's really aggravating. Anyway, moving on. You've seen me drill out the holes in the crossguard, and now I'm using the scroll saw to cut them into their more exact shape, before switching back to my wood carving chisels to further refine the shape. I'm trying hard to make this thing look as close as I can to the screen used prop, so you can bet I'm sure as heck going to use every tool in my arsenal to accomplish that. Once I got it all carved out, I used some sandpaper to smooth it up. Now that the crossguard was done, it was time to move on to the grip. Of course, that's after I made sure the camera was working. For the grip, I'm using the same stuff that I used for the crossguard. I cut it into a little chunk and then sliced it in two. My plan was to sandwich the tang between the two slices and glue in some filler pieces on either side of the tang. I pressed the pieces together, slid them off, and clamped them until they dried. In order to cut the grip down to its correct size, I slid the crossguard into place and then slid the grip on top of it. I then marked off everything that I wanted to cut away, which I did once again using the bandsaw. I got it down closer to its rough size and shape, and then shaped it further using both the bandsaw and the belt sander. This was more or less just rolling it around until I got it sanded down to its reference marks. Next up, it was time to start on the pommel. To make this piece, I used a combination of methods and blah blah blah, you get the idea. It's time to talk about Lord of the Rings now. As you know, I've already stated that I have an undying love for the Lord of the Rings. It is far and away my favorite trilogy of films ever made. Like, without question. It is a timeless masterpiece filled with love and beauty, drama and action, humor, and above all, hope. And not just hope in the generic sense, but hope in the face of hopelessness. Movies can mean many things to different people. But for me, these movies are a safe haven, and they fill me with a sense of peace and comfort. It's honestly difficult for me to articulate exactly what I mean. But literally every time I watch the movies, without fail, it's like,
white shores, and beyond, a far green country, and to a swift sunrise.
and no, I'm not saying it's like dying, but that's the best representation of how the movies make me feel. And I know, these movies aren't for everyone, and so maybe neither is this series. But for all you other weirdos out there like me, I hope you can enjoy it and see it as a token of our collective love and appreciation for this world, and these movies, and of course the books on which they're based. Speaking of which, I'm ashamed to admit that I still have not read all the way through the books. But I have an excuse. I spend all of my free time making YouTube videos, so anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit about Narsil, and specifically why I chose to make this project first instead of making the One Ring. First off, since the One Ring, and specifically its destruction, are the main driver of the story, it is shown and talked about a multitude of times through the films. But to me, its most iconic moment isn't in the very beginning of the film, but comes a few scenes later. No, in this beginning prologue, I believe that the most iconic moment is centered around Narsil, the Sword of the King. Right after Elendil, the King of Gondor, is struck down by Sauron, Isildur, his son, tries to take up his father's sword. Sauron immediately stomps down on it and smashes it to pieces. As Sauron reaches in to claim his victory, Isildur slashes out in a wild fury, and in doing so, cuts the ring from the hand of the Dark Lord Sauron. To me, this was a much more significant moment than just showing the One Ring, and so I wanted to capture that moment in this episode by making the sword. You know, with that in mind, I guess in essence, this episode can serve as a sort of prologue to the series, which means that the next episode will kick off the story proper, so you might be able to guess what that's going to be. Well now, it looks like we've got all of our pieces made, and this thing's ready for assembly. As you can see, I glued everything into place, piece by piece, starting with the crossguard, then the grip, and then the pommel. Once everything was assembled, I got out the modeling clay to start adding some details to the grip. I filled in any blemishes or seams, and then rolled out some bands to wrap around where the grip meets both the crossguard and the pommel. At the pommel, I smoothed everything out really well to make it look solid, and then wrapped a band around as a trim ring. Around the rest of the grip, I wrapped 6 more bands in evenly spaced locations to make them look like grip rings. Along the way, I used water to both bond the clay to the wood and also smooth everything out. You know, I gotta say, now that I have this thing all together, it looks pretty nice, and I really don't want to break it all apart. Whoops. Oh well, I guess I'll move on to painting then. Around the hilt, I used a filler primer to help fill in any seams or blemishes that I may have missed. Once that was dry, I switched over to regular primer and went on to add 2 coats to the entire sword. In between coats, I was sure to allow sufficient dry time, and I rubbed down each piece entirely with some steel wool before applying the next coat. I also masked off everything and painted the grip a flat black, but this proved to be fruitless because I ended up having to paint the black area by hand anyway. I then applied 1 coat of metallic aluminum over the entire sword, with the exception of the grip. And once that coat was dry, I then applied 2 coats of gloss clear coat. Once everything was dry, I got out the powdered graphite and began to polish each piece. It's sometimes hard to see it on screen, but this stuff does a really good job of giving a gunmetal sheen to the pieces. Throughout this whole process, I made multiple applications where I added some powdered graphite and then lightly scuffed things up, and then added some more graphite and then scuffed it up again. This gave everything some added texture and character. Next, I got out the flat black model paint and painted the grip. I then got out the metallic gold and added some accents to the inlays on both the pommel and then the crossguard. Once that part was done, I added some detail to the inscription on the pommel. By the way, if you're wondering what that inscription says, to the best of my knowledge, it says, "Narsil is my name, a mighty sword. Telkar made me in Nogrod." So, there you go. I know some of you out there were clamoring to know what that inscription said, and now you do. Just using some shoe polish here to add some finishing touches, and this project is complete. This is the third wooden sword that I've made. The first two being the swords from the movie 300. But I can honestly say that this one really blows me away. I absolutely love how this thing turned out. And while it did pain me to cut it into pieces, it was necessary for that moment in the story. Plus, on a more selfish note, since this is by design supposed to be a broken, damaged blade, it was nice to start with this as the first project in this series, because it didn't have to be perfect, which it most assuredly is not, but it definitely served to test my mettle at sword making. All things considered, I loved working on this project, and I love how beautiful it looks, and I truly feel that it would be a worthy addition to any fan's collection. Boy, I'll tell you, I really enjoyed making this sword. Didn't really like cutting it up, though. But who knows, maybe I'll get to make another version sometime that I don't have to cut up. Now I'm just going to have to come up with a permanent display setup for this and everything else. I love how this project turned out, and I'm so excited to show you guys everything I have planned. This whole series is a long time coming, and I know it's going to be nothing but pure joy for me to work on. Well, other than editing, of course. Like I said, I'm really excited to show you guys what I come up with. And if you enjoyed this, please go ahead and share it and tell your friends about it, because it really helps. And if you've never watched The Lord of the Rings, now's a good time to remedy that situation. And if you've seen it and don't like it, like I always say, it's okay to be wrong. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.